Josh Brown, the gaming industry is pretty much on fire at the minute. Various opinions, various things to break down here in regards to the viability of the AAA space. There's a ridiculous and very sad amount of layoffs also happening across the industry, but we're going to break down the various parts of this and get to something of a reason behind all the insanity as it exists right now.
We'll try to. It's a massive, massive topic, and sometimes we come into these videos and we're a little bit hyperbolic about how everything sucks, but it's hard to not just say everything sucks with the amount of news that has occurred over this past week, let alone from January, let alone from last year.
Yeah.
And in terms of layoffs, in terms of studio closures, in terms of games being cancelled, it's an unprecedented time.
Yeah, and I welcome as many, devs, perspectives, people inside the industry. Get down in the comments if you can. Share your stories, upvote them. Try and get as much exposure onto the reality of the people that are in the industry on the other side of the curtain, the other side of the coverage side as possible, because I would welcome as much of that stuff as possible. But yeah, up front, we have more cancellations in regards to games. We have a Mandalorian game that was in progress over at Respawn Entertainment. That's apparently been cancelled. We're going to get back to something that EA's been talking about in regards to future projects. They want to keep some franchise IP stuff within IPs that they already own. But a Mandalorian game has recently been cancelled, which already is a talking point, because if you can't get a Star Wars Mandalorian game over the finish line, what the hell's going on? It's worth noting that Embracer Group, the massive conglomerate that have been hoovering up various studios, have now cancelled 29 projects and potentially and counting. They were recently just brought up at the GDC, the Game Developers Conference, as a punchline. Greg Miller brought them up as just, oh my God, what the hell's going on thing. It feels like they're an increasingly big talking point as to how big that bet was, the amount of projects that might have got over the finish line that are now falling apart. And in regards to Embracer, Saber Interactive were one of the studios that were part of that. They've bought themselves out of the contract they were in, which isn't the case for various other studios that were sadly just had their project cancelled instead. Which brings about the conversation as to the viability of AAA, the AAA space. And looking at the ridiculous amount of layoffs, even studios like Insomniac, who brought you Spider-Man 2 last year, Naughty Dog, who brought you The Last of Us, Guerrilla, who brought you the Horizon games, they've also suffered layoffs. There are over 8,000 layoffs in 2024 alone, which joins the over 10,000 layoffs that we had in 2023. But it's also worth saying before I pass it over to Josh,
go on, keep going,
that the industry itself, the market, the general viability of the industry is up about 4% according to Jeff Grubb. The money is there. We're going to get back around to the AAA thing. It's just that a lot of the bets being made aren't necessarily working. However, that doesn't relate to the Sony stuff.
Yes.
We'll get there in regards to the Suicide Squads and the Skull and Bones, all that kind of stuff. But thoughts so far?
Yeah, I mean, obviously so much to pick apart here. The Sony stuff was a real stickler for me because I can't understand that, right?
No.
I don't understand how studios that are not just critical successes, but commercial successes like Insomniac, like Guerrilla and Naughty Dog have these layoffs. I think of Insomniac in particular, and they were bought by Sony in, I want to say, 2020-ish?
Yeah.
2018, 2019. Not long ago is the point, for like $200 million. They have released so many games in that time frame. They've had Spider-Man Miles Morales for the PlayStation 5. They have had Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. They've had Spider-Man 2. They've got Wolverine in production. They've released these massively successful games. They've released these critically successful games to support Sony's platform. Yeah. A few of these were exclusives, or at least were used to sell the machine on its full specs, and their reward is to get layoffs. Like, at what point is a studio stable? At what point is a studio viable? If someone like Insomniac, who is making, good profits on their games, yes, we will talk about how something like Spider-Man 2 cost $300 million to make, but it still is already making a profit now, and that game's only been out a couple of months. If those studios can't remain unaffected, what chance does the smaller teams have?
I think there's a lot of stuff here that points to the idea of a reckoning in the industry. Like, well, you can point to specific titles, the likes of Helldivers 2 blowing up, Palworld blowing up, Skull and Bones, Suicide Squad bombing on the other side of that, as to a market response to the types of games that people are after. But then even when you look at the PlayStation output, you look at Spider-Man, Horizon, God of War. God of War not being involved in this because it's not Sony Santa Monica, but the PlayStation identity, if that's not holding everybody up, that seems like to be an even bigger talking point as to the viability of that size of project.
So angry about this whole thing. It's who who's responsible for the disappointment, if you could call it, within those companies? You know, the interim Sony CEO, just before these 900 layoffs were announced, was talking about how they're still making money. It's just that the margins are getting a little bit smaller. I think they said they're currently on like a 6% profit in terms of their revenue, where it used to be like 12 or 13, or at least that was the margin for all of their products. And that's just shrank a little bit. So it's not like they've lost money. Like you said at the start, like this is a company that's up year on year. And you look at whose quote unquote fault that shrinkage would be, right? It, in my eyes, it's not on the studios who are continuing to pump out these games that are financially successful and are bringing in the bulk of that money. So, like, why is it always, this is what I always wonder, why is it always the people who have grafted and produced these successful games that take the brunt of decisions that they were involved in? That's always the thing that I cannot get my head around, because it's easier to fire someone further down the ladder than it is to fire an executive or a CEO.
That's the thing. Like, at the minute, and even as we're recording this, there might be another story about another round of layoffs. At the minute, there's been one every day for the last few weeks, if not the entirety of 2024. And yesterday, there were various reports as to studios buying themselves out of contracts, certain layoffs that were happening every few hours. The next thing that's worth saying in regards to PlayStation is just something that VGC reported back in 2023 about the viability of PlayStation overall, saying that the company's game and network services division did report financial year 2023 Q2 revenues of 954.1 billion yen, which is $6.32 billion, up 32% year on year. PlayStation are flying right now. They're doing very, very well.
Yeah.
And if that money doesn't trickle back down to the people actually creating the games in the first place, then that makes it a very bad place to be if you're looking to get into the gaming industry. Like you said, and like I'm saying, the frequency of reports that's coming out, it's not like we're hearing about, anything close to it, to CEOs leaving, redistributing the money around the company, etc. It's probably an oversimplification, but at the same time, all you ever read about are art departments, coders, people actually turning the games around, being laid off at a moment's notice.
Yeah.
And it's worth throwing in as well, you've got Doom, because this is very much the conversation in the industry at the moment. Doom creator John Romero tweeted saying, "I've been in the game industry since I was a kid, and I've never seen anything like what we're seeing now." And I do want to wrap that back around to, the likes of Warner Brothers saying, Suicide Squad didn't meet our expectations. But I think a lot of that goes alongside the idea of creative versus business, and making something that is geared entirely towards business, neglecting the creative side. And then the people at the bottom, let's say, or the people who are doing the bulk of the work, suffering the repercussions of that when they weren't able to be valued when it mattered the most.
Like, look, man, we're going to talk about games like Suicide Squad that didn't make money or came in under expectations. But when I look at the Sony things, and I won't go on about them for too much, but they're just, like I said, the ones I can't quite fathom.
Xbox has had layoffs as well, it's worth
saying. Oh, of course, Xbox, they also had 900. EA cut 5% of its staff. But looking at these big studios that make successful games, I always wonder, what, it's not even like they're losing money. I wouldn't personally necessarily agree with sacking people just because a game, didn't make a profit. Like, that kind of knee-jerk reaction, I just don't vibe with. Anyway, that's not part of my ideology, but a shrinkage in a margin, who is that on? I don't understand. The money is still coming in. These people have helped you ship a console, have shipped these games for you, have allowed the PlayStation 5, after a time of chip shortages and it being unavailable, to match the sales of the PlayStation 4, which was a huge success. How are they then rewarded by being kicked out the door so the shareholders can make that 6% go up to 10%? That's what I always find really just dehumanizing and horrible about this whole thing. But yeah, I'll stop talking about Sony, because otherwise there'll be an hour and a half podcast I'll be turning this into. We've got too much to talk about.
I think, it is very much an endemic of the industry overall. I think that whole conversation on the fact that there are so many shareholder focused moves made, and you can feel it when you play the games that are geared towards making shareholders spend, and 9 times out of 10 they bomb anyway, like a Suicide Squad. But it is that part of this conversation is the viability of that level of production, the idea of, is AAA production a viable part of the industry? I would say that in regards to the pricing model, I feel like the market has rejected the £70, $70 pricing model.
Yeah.
Not necessarily outright. You still have some titles that succeed anyway, like your Spider-Mans to a degree. But I think that you look at the success of Palworld and Helldivers from this year alone, 2 games that were sold for less than £40 over in the UK. I think 45 maybe for Helldivers 2's Fancy Edition or whatever. But they have blown the hell up. Palworld doesn't seem to have that much of a tail on it at this point, but Helldivers 2 is absolutely flying right now. And has a general feel of goodwill around it. And the pricing model is part of that. I think a lot of people, the conversation to this point was because of the £70 price tag, people were just going to hang back and be like, well, I'm not going to be able to buy as many games as I would like to. And then games release broken, you get your Redfalls, you get whatever. Like, there is a general distrust there of a certain level of game as well, whereas like indie stuff tends to come in a little bit smoother. The project scope is smaller, things can be refined a bit better. I think there are many facets to this, and that's one that really sticks out. I do want to throw in, you have the viability of this space, the viability of something like a Spider-Man, and the fact that EA have cancelled their Star Wars game, licensing fees. It's not like this problem is restricted just to the gaming space in regards to everything going up, the growth models, the percentages, everything else. The way that Insomniac were able to make Spider-Man, that percentage that they had to pay the license fee was somewhere between 30 and 50%, according to the leak that happened with Insomniac. And it's just like that whole echelon of the industry as well.
Yeah.
That idea of like, oh, well, surely that would be a surefire bet. Even that isn't going to work either.
Oh, you've made some great points there, Scott.
Thank you.
About both the price point and that.
I'm around
final point. I'll jump off that in terms of like the viability and the licensing fees, because again, that allows me to make the point once again that it's not the QA testers, it's not the programmers, it's not even the creative directors of these studios that are making those deals, which studios, publishers are now finding harmful. It's the executives at the top that are allowing Marvel to come in and take, a big chunk of the revenue, or Star Wars or whoever. And yet, like I said, it's the QA testers and everyone else who pays that price. If they don't think that's viable, that's on them. It's like, of course, Insomniac wanted to make a Spider-Man game, but a lot of the times this mandate comes from the top down, like EA saying, we've got this Star Wars license, we're obviously going to use it. DICE, you're now making Battlefront. Visceral Games, you're now making Star Wars, and then we're going to close you down because we don't like where that's going. Stuff like that, it's kind of ridiculous. And yeah, these licensed IPs, the translation from, say, movies to video game adaptations, popularity in one medium just hasn't correlated with popularity in another. We've seen the likes of The Avengers completely bomb, lose Square Enix so much money. Even great games like Guardians of the Galaxy not do all that well. These brand names, I imagine, a decade ago, were probably looked at by executives who thought, well, that's an excuse to print money. These things are popular, games are popular, David Brent, the fingers together, we'll make billions. That hasn't been the case because, surprise, surprise, players and fans are smarter than just seeing a thing they recognize and flocking towards it. I always say, man, I think video games, in terms of movies and maybe not so television, but it's one of the last art forms that is a bastion for true originality and new IP and new stories. If you look at Sony's success last gen, it wasn't because they relied on older titles. It was because they introduced new original things that we hadn't seen, like Horizon, that like Ghost of Tsushima, that sparked our excitement. Even Days Gone, Of course, they had IPs alongside them, but I really think that took them to the next level. They were giving people things they hadn't seen, whereas that immediately shifted to, we need to give people things they have only seen before, and that's resulted in not only having to get those licenses at a major cost, but then those games not even being what the market wants anyway.
No, to round off the licensing point as well, it's worth saying that even EA, don't make FIFA games anymore. Like, they started their own thing, the FC Club, or FC 24. I don't care about football, but they're not making FIFA games anymore. And we also had, CEO Andrew Wilson saying that they're going forward, they're moving away from future licensed IP that they don't believe will be successful in such a changing medium. And that's from gamesindustry.biz. But you have, even them evaluating like the viability of Star Wars, the viability of being able to do a licensed project. And then it has come out from this most recent stuff that the Iron Man game and the Black Panther game are still in production.
Right.
So if that's all under the Disney wing, in regards to, the fee to make a Star Wars game or whatever it is, some stuff is still surviving.
Again, like some stuff, but it goes back to that viability conversation. You mentioned the Respawn game right at the start.
Yes.
To me, in my head, the Insomniac thing is its own example, but if you can't make a Mandalorian game that's first person from Respawn, who are like the masters of first person shooters. That is testing well internally, that people have a lot of passion for. Like, what can you greenlight? That seems like as safe a bet as you can get, and even that is apparently not viable to these big studios in the current market. And to me, that's crazy. I just kind of want to use a bit of corpo speak, Scott, circle back round to what you said about the price point earlier on, because I do think that is a problem as well. You know, some of the disasters this year, like Suicide Squad and Skull and Bones, I wonder if they would have reached a bigger audience if they weren't charging that premium price point, because with that price point comes a level of expectation, comes an expectation of quality, and it's just a lot of money always, but especially in the current, you know, economic situation that we're all in. I was telling you, you know, before coming in to record, like, I'm financially stable at the moment, touch wood, thank God. You know, I do games for a living.
Yes.
And even I look at £70 games and think that's a lot of money. I don't think I can get Tekken 8. I don't think I'm going to be able to get Final Fantasy 7 at full price, because there's so much vying for your attention. There's so much outside of media that you need to spend your money on. It's a big sink. And I think, like, if someone's whose job it is to cover games doesn't feel confident paying for games, what does, like, the average consumer do, or someone who isn't financially stable, you know?
Yeah, and even if you do pay for them, chances are it'll be broken. It needs a patch. It needs some sort of frame rate bug. There's some weird server sync issue, like whatever the hell the thing is. But yeah, that's one part of the AAA conversation, is the idea, the influx of licensed stuff. Then also, you know, being a double-edged sword. Another part of the Insomniac leak revealed that they are working on Marvel projects for the next, let's say, 5 years, for the rest of the PlayStation 5 and probably likely into the PS6. And it's just, that is assumed to be a safer way to go. But I think a lot of that still goes against the potential for more creative variation in the games that are getting greenlit. It's not all brand Bible, make an X-Men game type stuff.
Yeah.
I want to say a bit more about the viability of the AAA space. So there's a quote from Neil Druckmann in here, but carry on.
Yeah, going back to what you mentioned at the beginning about, like, what is viable for these companies and, like, that broader question, that's something that I want to know. Like, what are you expecting to get out of games? Like, what is the ceiling that you're trying to hit? Because, yeah, you look at those licenses, you look at how reliable they've been for Sony in particular. I know I've just said that they haven't been for so many other studios, but if something like Spider-Man 2 is the fastest selling, you know, PlayStation game that they've had, and it's already sold 5 million copies or 10 million copies, and it's just going to keep on going, like, what type of return are you looking for from those games?
Yeah.
You know, like,
just endless.
What's gonna be enough? Are you trying to chase the profits of the 1% of live service games that manage to rake in, you know, $1 billion every other day? Or is, you know, a profit of $200 million, $300 million, is that going to be enough? That's kind of what I would like to be clarified. What even is a success to these big companies?
Yeah, they don't know. Like, the people that are the industry is so much bigger now. John Romero, I mentioned him before, saying that he's never seen anything like this. Someone did reply to him saying, is this a video game crash? Is this similar to 1983's video game crash? And it's not. I mean, the market isn't rejecting video games. Like, the industry size is completely different. Romero says the industry was so much smaller back then, but I think the industry is so much bigger now. There are so many, like, whether that be media license properties involved or just the sheer amount of bodies that are involved, you do get more business focused, colder people at the top, I would say.
Yeah.
That have to make a lot more colder decisions. And whether that's great for business and great for them, I'm not slagging them off as individuals, but I think it comes across as potentially more business-orientated moves. That has to have that underlying feeling of, but make as much money as you possibly can.
Yeah.
Like, there's not a, like, oh, that was good, let's move on to the next one. You can just, I think that's part of the wider conversation. Who are at the top? Who are the people making these decisions? There is a big difference between Sean Layden's run, who oversaw a lot of the first-party PS4 narrative-driven stories that defined the PlayStation 4 era, and the Jim Ryan era, who was way more of a cold business guy. And a lot of the conversations that came from that. Two more things to throw in. Jason Schreier said last year, or maybe been the year before, that the way AAA gaming is at the minute, that if something was entering into development right now, chances are it will be a 10-year dev cycle, or at least it wouldn't be ready until the next generation of consoles. That is just such an untenable way to approach getting a creative idea out there. Which goes alongside what Neil Druckmann has recently said on the Logically Speaking podcast, which I would recommend overall. He said that he doesn't see himself doing this forever at this scale, i.e. the Last of Us 2 type scales. He mentions that he had so much fun making Uncharted 2, and that was back in 2009.
Yeah.
And he says that everything's been a lot harder since then. He said that right now it just takes a lot. It takes a lot out of you. It's very stressful to manage that many people and multiple studios worldwide. That quote was shared on Twitter. We then had Cory Barlog from Sony Santa Monica, creator, to help get God of War. I was going to say creator. He's not David Jaffe, but making God of War, creative director on the 2018 God of War and Ragnarok. Saying that he agreed with him. He was like, same man, same. Like, if you're doing these projects for this long, it's another part of that conversation. Like, would you even want to work on a project for 8 years that might bomb in the end, like Suicide Squad?
Yeah, man. I mean, it's I said on the UBP podcast, which you should
Please go check it out.
Check out, by the way, that, these people are fundamentally creatives at heart, right? The people who are making these games, what they want to do is create the best game possible. So it doesn't surprise me that they get burnt out, not only because of the working conditions of working on a game in general and the amount of graft that goes into it, the amount of sacrifices you have to make, but the more you climb the corporate ladder, like a Cory Barlog, like a Neil Druckmann, the more fights you have to have every day with the management about what they think the game should be. And that's fundamentally not what they got in the job to do.
No,
if that's taken up even 20% of your time, it's probably too much for you. You know what I mean? You're already juggling the massive responsibility of one of these humongous projects to then have to constantly go against or take notes from a studio that's saying, can we get this microtransaction in? Can we shave this plot beat down so it's a little bit more appealing? Like, no wonder these people are burnt out and don't think they have games of this scale left in them and kind of maybe want to shift out the industry entirely or go to a smaller scale of production where they maybe don't have to answer to those shareholders in the same way that they do now.
And I feel like you see that across the board, whether it be in the movie space. Like I said, you can feel it. You can feel corporate influence on a creative idea and a creative vision. Not to make it all about Madam Web, but I feel like that is such a specifically cleaved. He's loving the Madam Web?
Make it all about Madam Web, please. I wish this video was all about Madam Web. We'd be much happier.
Some of the certain ways that certain superhero movies went, like the 2016 Suicide Squad, Madam Web, various projects that feel corporately hacked to death, and we get the reports afterwards about the reality of how those things were put together. In the likes of the Suicide Squad movie in 2016, hiring a advertising company, a marketing firm to edit the film together, and removed all potential facet of a creative vision going throughout. It was just make the shiniest thing possible and put the most popular songs behind it.
Great point, man.
I'm full of them.
You're full of them. It reminds me of the Anthem postmortem that I want to say Jason Schreier did on Kotaku a good few years ago now. But they were talking about when they were producing the game, they were pretty much just trying to appeal to Andrew Wilson's tastes, who was an executive of maybe even the CEO of EA.
On his way.
And they were talking about they were essentially building demos towards the end, trying to just kind of put features in there that would please him. Like, I'm pretty sure the jetpack was put in there just to have something to impress this one guy. Mm-hmm. And when that one guy you're trying to impress isn't necessarily even a video game guy, it's more of a business person who maybe has a casual interest in video games, who thinks they know what the market likes. Like, that bottleneck is crazy.
Yes.
And that bottleneck is everywhere now, even more so than it was when Anthem was being made.
Yeah. Let's pivot towards what's going to happen going forward, because you do have various analysts weighing in saying that, this type of ostensibly market contrition does happen every year to various different degrees. It's a hell of a lot worse at the minute, specifically because of the amount of overhiring that happened during the pandemic. But it's and that meant that a lot of studios hired up because of the way that we were all playing games across the pandemic. A lot of people had a lot more free time. They played a hell of a lot more games on average, and there was a lot more viability for more, games in general to exist right next to each other. So there's a lot of overhiring that happened then. There's also various commentary going around about the idea of trying to match growth numbers year on year and getting rid of these teams to just, if you free up some wages, that goes into your growth. And that being part of it as well. That's part of the bottom line of why this stuff's happening. But I think we can touch on that stuff more. But I think a lot of the pivot in general is what the hell happens now. And I do think it is time for the rise of the AA. Like, I do think you look at the Helldivers, the Pacific Drives, you look at games that wow up front visually, which is usually the marker of a high-priced game. If you can wow the masses and go, hey, that game looks absolutely gorgeous, but it cost a fraction of what that usually would to make, the likes of Hellblade, that Ninja Theory were trying to prove back in 2017 or 2018, that you can make a AAA-looking game on an indie budget. I think that's what the future of gaming is. I don't think it's worth hanging this many bodies on sheer cutscene fidelity, even though it's not as simple as that. I do think the general production scale needs to go down. It's what Druckmann was hinting at. It's what Sean Layden talked about when he exited the industry before Jim Ryan came in. And I do think that's the way. I think you're seeing it with various studios and games, like Exodus is being made by ex-BioWare devs for assumedly a much smaller price point than something like Anthem would be. You've got Gearbox looking to get away from Embracer. There's a whole thing going on at the minute where various studios are trying to free up the wider corporate overlord stuff to restore the creativity from the ground up. And I think that's going to be the future of the entire industry. Whether the market accepts that is a whole other thing.
That's it, right?
Do they want Red Dead 2's Last of Us 2's and that's it? I don't think so. Look at Helldivers.
I want to jump into the pandemic reasoning just before we go on to that. Again, great point. I think that's like... Obviously, it had an impact. People did see the numbers go up. Executives saw the numbers go up during the pandemic because everyone was playing games, and they, started hiring, started putting projects into, started putting money into projects, thinking that level of growth or sustainability was going to be sustainable. But my question is, and this is to you, Jimmy executive who makes $500 million a year, are you an idiot? Are you an idiot? Because everyone, even an idiot like myself, knew that was an anomaly. It was something that probably wouldn't continue, or it was never going to remain that high. They were pretty extenuating circumstances, I think we can all agree on. So again, that makes me think, that's your fault, Jimmy exec, who's making $500 million a year. You made the decision to think that was going to be the norm going forward, and then you overhired. So why aren't you getting laid off?
Yes.
And your $500 million can be dispersed, and we can realign after that. That's all I have to say on that, because I think I'm getting on my soapbox right now.
I think that's fine.
But going back to what your second point was, Scott, in the rise of the AA, again, I think we've used the word a lot. It's a viability issue. It's those games can make a lot of money. We've seen Helldivers make a lot of money. We saw Palworld make a lot of money with smaller budgets, smaller price points, and, perhaps more appealing even gameplay.
I was going to say, really good gameplay, forward game design, something that hooks your attention, makes you want to play it, as opposed to another QuickTime event, another squeeze through, another standard thing you've played a million times over for the last 10 years.
I've just seen big companies resist games and movements like that so much. I'm old enough to remember EA telling me that single-player games weren't viable, that nobody wants to play horror games, because those types of games at the time didn't make as much money as EA was wanting out of this endeavor. So I think there absolutely is a reality where AA games can make a lot of money. I don't see the shift towards that, because I don't think it would ever be their dream amount of money, and I think we would definitely be a healthier industry if those expectations were brought down. But I look at the likes of Embracer closing all of those studios. I look at the likes of 505 Games having layoffs. These smaller publishers, these smaller developers that are being impacted the same way as the AAAs. Sony shut down London studio. It seems to have pretty much abandoned its investment in PSVR 2 now with these closures, and it's those are the smaller games that could help boost your portfolio. But if you're getting rid of them, and then you're also impacting the AAA, to me it indicates, at least in the short term, an even narrower AAA view of, we need everything to make $10 billion in live services, or it's not worth the effort.
I think as we go, because if we do concluding statements or whatever, I feel like that.
We're lawyers.
We're just going to wrap it up, put the tie on. I feel like that model that they're potentially trying to focus even more in on has already failed multiple times over. I honestly think the only way forward is a return to where the industry was circa 2013-ish. The beginning of the 2010s, the level of production that we had. Yes, you can get better graphics, you can put more time into that. Certain Rising Tide Racers or ships things exist, like Unreal Engine 5 being more available or whatever it is. But I think in regards to the variation that is necessary in a creative medium, an interactive entertainment medium, it needs to have that variation that isn't in the upper echelon of games right now. And I think the only way to get that back is to reduce things down. I've always said I would have 10 smaller projects from Naughty Dog, Rockstar, Insomniac, whoever, than one big thing every 10 years, because I just don't think that's viable. I think the numbers back that up. So whatever that takes to siphon off the people at the very top, well, it needs to make all this money. They do have shareholders to appease. That's why people are getting out of those big corporate structures, to divorce themselves from those things and disconnect from it. I just think that's the only way to stay healthy in this model. You can stick around and keep trying to make the one big thing every 8 years, and some people will love doing that. But I think that most of them, and the market included, doesn't support that.
Right.
And I just think that certain things are too big, and I think you're seeing the bubble burst in real time.
I think, as my closing statement, I do feel like I'm in Better Call Saul right now. I guess I would just want to end by shining a light on like the developers who have lost work, who have lost their roles.
Oh, yeah.
Might have to relocate, to get financial issues, might not be able to get rehired. I've seen a lot of sentiment online from devs, both still in the industry and those who have been laid off, by saying like, this is a video game crash, in that it's not that these people have been laid off or these studios are downsizing, it's the amount of knowledge and talent that is now being lost. Some people who have worked on video games for most of their adult lives or the past 10 years and have garnered that expertise, those are the people who could be ushering in the future, and those are the people who are being let go. And I think that is something important to kind of not overlook, because if those people are leaving, and then the people at the top creatively, like Cory Barlog and Neil Druckmann and Hideo Kojima, if it's getting too much for them and they only have a few games left in them, like, what are we left with? We can't have that gulf of expertise and knowledge, I don't think, because what does gaming become after that? I think it becomes executives being able to just say, put a spreadsheet in, get these checklists in, monetize that.
It's AI.
Ship the product. Yeah.
It's AI-generated video games, which is assumedly the end point of where that upper echelon would go. Minimize creativity, only do bankable elements, and give us the most boring games possible that to them would be the most bankable games possible. And that goes in that direction. But all around, do better.